Alright guys, so what I've got for you today is the Smallrig Sony a7s cage. I believe this is labeled the 1518 on Smallrig's site, and it is a tiny little $65 form-fitting rig. You can see I've got a few extras on here, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. But basically, this is a move away from the giant rig that takes up a lot of space in your kit down to a tiny little form factor rig that gives you a lot of mounting options, but doesn't really approach or encroach on your use of your camera body. This particular model, designed for the A7S, is the newer version. I've got the older version right here, and I'll be comparing and contrasting the changes they've made from this version to this version. But first, let's take a closer look at the Smallrig A7S cage. Taking a closer look at the Smallrig Sony a7s cage, you can see that it has a nice little recessed area for the captive quarter 20 screw on the bottom. There's plenty of quarter 20 mounts to adapt a QR plate. You've got two little posts right here that are your integrated sort of holders to keep the camera in place. Spinning it to the side here, you can see there's plenty of quarter 20 mounts up and down here, and along the side where I've got this NATO rail, which is fairly convenient. And looking at the top, there's a cutout that's fairly easy to get to for the hot shoe adapter if you're using the XLR audio interface, as well as plenty of other quarter 20s to mount cold shoe adapters, NATO rails, and so on. I mentioned at the beginning of the video that I've added a few things to my Smallrig configuration. Notably, these are the NATO rails that are on the top and the side here. These are the longer versions, the 15 centimeter versions, and they'll set you back around $18 to $25. And the reason they're really handy to get is because basically it gives you the option to configure this pretty much however you want. And for me particularly, it sort of gives me the feel of a traditional rig without getting all of that extra big bulkiness around it. Now with this handle right here on this side, I've basically got a nice grip for the Sony a7S on this side, and I've got a nice grip on this side for the Sony a7S. I still have plenty of access to quarter 20 mounts if I want to put an arm on here or anything else, and it gives me sort of that run and gun style of shooting that I like with something like a bulldog cage or one of the square cages with the double handles on either side. Again, no shoulder mounts on this, but I tend to shoot more like this than I do with a shoulder ENG style. When you undo this, you press this to release, and now you can slide it onto the top of this NATO rail. And with this particular configuration, you kind of get a nice balanced sort of setup here, and you can see that this is really even across the top. It gives you that sort of handle from the top sort of configuration that you see on other rigs, and a balanced way to get low-level shots, get close to the ground, or whatever you want. It also has the cold shoe adapter right here, so if you want to mount a microphone or something like that, you can. In this same configuration now, if you take one of these guys, which is around $100, you can slide this on like so. And now, on top of having a handle and a mount up here, you also have sort of this adjustable arm on the side. And this arm gives you the option to mount an EVF, field monitor, or whatever you want to the rig, and sort of slide it up and down and get it to where you want it to be. Now, the other nice thing about this is because it's on a NATO rail as opposed to using a quarter 20 friction arm, it doesn't have the tightening, loosening issue that you run into on those friction arms. Because you're basically on a fixed rail, you don't have to worry about this unscrewing from the quarter 20 and flopping your monitor over. Much more solid connection in general, and a much better configuration for your field monitor with the Sony a7S. Taking a look at the Smallrig cage with the Sony a7S removed, you can basically see this is a C-shaped cage. They use Allens, 3 of them each, to hold the top to the side plate and the bottom to the side plate, and you can see those right here. There's 3 across the bottom and 3 across the top. It gives you a good solid connection from the side plate to the base plate, and you can apply a lot of force to this and you don't really get any flexing. The design and the finish of this is really nice. Good quality coating on this machined bit here, and nothing really scrapes if you take your fingernail and really try and dig into it. That's a good sign, and overall fit and finish is pretty nice, even down to these pads here, which I don't know if these are hand cut or what they do, but they fit into the machined bit pretty nicely, and they've done a good job overall of keeping this nice and high quality without really cutting too many corners for the price. Overall, I'm pretty happy with the design of the Smallrig A7s cage, but I do have a few minor complaints. The first one, and probably the most important for me, is actually this base right here. You'll notice that I've got this adapter, lens adapter, for the A-mount to E-mount lenses. If you're using an A-mount camera in the past and you moved over to the A7s or one of the A7 series cameras, you're going to need this in order to adapt your lenses. Or if you have old Minolta glass, that can also be an issue. And if you look at the bottom of this here, you'll notice that the Smallrig cage is a little bit lower profile than this unit right here. And what that ends up meaning is if you have a QR plate like the 501 PL, which is Manfrotto's very popular plate, or one of the other units that are very similar in size from Gh4 or so on, you're going to end up with a plate that sort of sits at an angle and doesn't really secure this properly, and your camera is going to be a little bit wonky. Now you can use some adapter pieces here to kind of raise this up and make room for that, but it would be really nice if Smallrig addressed this by either providing some sort of Swiss cheese plate or a raised plate or a thicker unit in order to accommodate for adapters like this. It might not be a huge issue if you're using something like the Metabones adapter, because the Metabones adapter, you can of course remove that bottom foot, but with the Sony A7 A-mount to E-mount adapter, you don't really have that option. So I've talked with them. DC, one of the fans that watches the show, has also talked with them as well, and between the two of us, I think we're working on a good design to fix that. So that may be addressed in the near term. The other two things I have that kind of bother me a little bit, and this isn't really a game ending sort of problem, it's just something you need to be aware of. If you look right here, the space is really close to the top of the camera. The thread goes all the way through the rig, and if you use too long of a 1/4-20 screw, say you have a friction arm or something like that and you have that attached and you screw that in, that could actually go through and hit the top of your camera and possibly damage it. I wouldn't mind seeing those either capped off or maybe, you know, stopped at the end so that you can't screw through them and then actually hit your A7S. Now, Smallrig does provide low profile 1/4-20 bolts to go with something like this NATO rail right here. So as long as you use the provided screws and the hardware that they're selling, it works just fine and it's not an issue. But it is something to keep an eye out for if you're using something with a longer 1/4-20 adapter mount. The last thing I have to complain about on this rig, and this isn't really a huge issue, but it's something that just bothered me a little bit. I bought this originally with a smaller NATO rail adapter, and here's the larger NATO rail adapter. The reason I ended up not using this little guy is because these screws here at the top, you can see this is too close together. What I mean basically is the bolt pattern to put two of their Allen head 1/4-20 screws in there, they end up frictioning against each other and you can't really get them in correctly. I understand that they needed to provide that sort of spacing for these first two because there's nothing underneath of them, but for the last two over here, which is along the main rail, it would have been nice to see those spaced the same way the rest of the 1/4-20s are spaced across the unit. That would allow you to easily place this right here, and you might not need as long of a rail setup if that's the case. One of the nice things about Smallrig as a company is that they have a really easy way to interact with them. And if you come up with a good idea that will make one of their products better, a lot of times they'll implement it and release a new version. They're not just leaving these designs stagnant and not updating them. The A7S has been out for a while and they're still iterating. They went from this to this, and we could see newer designs for this in the future, which is really good. A lot of times companies will create a rig for a camera body of some kind, and even if there's problems with it, they don't really do anything about it. And as a user, it's nice to be able to contact them and say, hey, look, I don't like this design and here's what I think you can do to improve it. And if you do that, they don't always take your advice, but when they do, it usually improves the product substantially. In the case of this A7S cage, it was nice that they put a captive 1/4-20 screw on the bottom and made the bottom plate a little bit more handy to use in general. Overall, the design of this rig is very nice, and I think they're doing a great job as they move forward. The price is right on these guys. That entire configuration I was showing you with the arm on the side as well as the handle, it's going to set you back around $200. And if you want to just buy the base cage, it's about $65. Adding the little bits and pieces, each of those adds up, but you can buy as little or as much as you want to configure your rig however you see fit, and that gives you a lot of options. Smallrig's a great company. I do like their products, and the build quality and design of this are top notch, especially for the price. A lot of times when you start dipping down to sub $100, you don't get necessarily the best quality, but in this case, all metal, well designed, very solid, very durable, and well thought out sort of cage for the A7S. As usual, guys, if you want to find out more about the Smallrig cage, you can swing over to DSLRfilmnoob.com and get a full write-up as well as more images, a review, and what have you. You can also find me on Twitter, check out the podcast on iTunes, I'll have a link to that in the crotch bar below. And as always, guys, thanks for watching, and if you like this content, you should do one of these right here.